A lot of what we think we know about history is just pure rubbish. The Vikings didn't actually wear horn helmets, mostly because they haven't invented peacocking yet. Cleopatra was actually from a Macedonian family, and Napoleon wasn't particularly short. Even Marie Antoinette turns out not to have been a world-renowned confectioner. And yet a quick Google search for Marie Antoinette cakes makes me want to abandon my diet immediately. Some things just feel like they should be true, and thus they end up seeping into the collective imagination. And with the global reach of media today, the effect is only amplified. Nowhere is this more obvious than with today's topic. So sit back and relax while we take a historical and biblical trip through time to find out why you are all wrong about building the pyramids. The most popular story? That the pyramids were built by slaves, sometimes even said to be Jewish slaves. But none of that is true. The actual evidence shows that pyramid builders were paid Egyptian laborers, not slaves. Excavations at the Giza workers' town uncovered barracks, bakeries, breweries, administrators' houses, and even proper cemeteries for the workers. Not exactly the conditions of chained-up slave labor. Bones show healed injuries, so medical care, and records describe rations of bread, beer, and a frankly shocking amount of meat. You could argue these workers were eating better than some grad students today. However, the newest iPhone they excavated was a 6S, and they even found some Android phones, so at least by millennial standards, the laborers were actually gravely oppressed. So who were these workers? Archaeology points to a core of skilled permanent craftsmen, stonemasons, surveyors, boatmen, administrators, supplemented by rotating teams of farmers during the annual Nile flood when the fields were underwater. We even found quarry marks by ancient gangs, like the Friends of Khufu graffiti, suggesting different work crews subdivided into named gangs and smaller squads. Sadly, the Egyptians never developed an IT crew. Turns out you can't have one without a basement to banish them to, and mud brick construction just didn't really support building underground. And then there's Mira's diary, known as the Wadi al-Jarf papyri, the oldest known papyrus in existence. It's a day-by-day log from an inspector describing how his boat crews hauled fine limestone to Khufu's pyramid. If you were hoping for aliens with tractor beams, sorry, best I can do is spreadsheets. The Egyptians had some clever tricks. There may have been a now vanished branch of the Nile running close to Giza, making river transport possible. On land, stones were dragged on sledges over wetted sand. You could say they turned a giant construction project into a very slow-moving slip and slide.
Okay, but some of the workforce still could have been slaves, specifically Jewish slaves, right? A little disclaimer is needed here. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to assume that the Old Testament is a historical document because adding supposedly to every sentence would get boring very quickly.
Let's start with the most glaring problem, the dates. The pyramids were built around 2600 to 2500 BCE. The earliest possible presence of Israelites in Egypt, according to the biblical timeline, is between 1500 and 1200 BCE. That's over 1,000 years later. Saying the Israelites built the pyramids is like saying, oh yeah, I remember Barack Obama.
Let me be clear.
He and Taylor Swift founded the Holy Roman Empire, right?
And to be clear, Exodus never actually says the Israelites built the pyramids. It says they were forced to build store cities like Pithom and Ramses, doing the manual labor but also producing bricks and various materials. And the slavery label probably made you make wrong assumptions about how they got to Egypt in the first place. The reason the Israelites were in Egypt wasn't because they were captured in slave raids or lost some war. In fact, quite the opposite. A massive famine struck their homeland, and they traveled to Egypt as a last resort to avoid starvation. At that time, one of their own, Joseph, had already been brought to Egypt after being sold into slavery by his brothers. But don't judge them too harshly, they had a good reason. See, they were jealous of his colourful coat, because unlike the Vikings, the ancient Jews did in fact invent peacocking, and Joseph's riz was just out of control. Despite that beginning, and probably thanks to the aforementioned riz, Joseph rose to the high position of vizier, second only to Pharaoh himself. When the famine came, he persuaded the Pharaoh to provide food and allow his family and people to settle in Egypt. Talk about not holding a grudge for the whole selling him into slavery thing. He should have at least demanded his cool coat back.
Anyway, thanks to Joseph, the Israelites settled in Egypt. But then, a generation later, a new pharaoh eventually came to power, saw their growing numbers, and, out of fear, enslaved them. So, just to be clear, how did saving a tribe from starvation eventually turn out for the Egyptians? Plagues, dead cattle, and Pharaoh drowning in the Red Sea, proving once again that no good deed goes unpunished.
Not from the Book of Exodus, not even from Josephus or Herodotus, ancient historians who toss the idea around but aren't widely read in pop culture. The myth comes from Hollywood, specifically the Ten Commandments, first made in 1923, then remade in 1956. That's where we got the iconic scenes of Jewish slaves hauling massive stone blocks. Once those images hit theaters, they stuck in the cultural imagination. The idea still pops up everywhere. Ridley Scott's Exodus, Gods and Kings in 2014, for example, gave us Christian Bale as Moses, freeing slaves who were, once again, building pyramids. And as much as I'd love to say this video will finally kill the myth, I know better. In the year 3000, Bender will still be forcing slave labor to build his own giant metal pyramid and statue.
Ah yes, the breaking news from March 2025. Supposedly, radar from orbit revealed massive pylons or even a city underneath the pyramids. Sounds amazing, but the method hasn't been used before, and the data actually looks like this, so I wouldn't say that's definitely a city. But hey, maybe I'm wrong and we'll end up finding a whole metropolis under the pyramids. Hopefully it will have a fully functioning Stargate. Richard Dean Anderson is getting pretty old though, so the military will need to find someone else to lead the fight against the Goa'uld. And once we capture one of the fancy pyramid-shaped spaceships, we will just have to admit that we were in fact all wrong about building the pyramids.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider clicking the like button and subscribing. It really helps grow the channel. See you in the next one.